Hello, everyone, and welcome back to The Shift. My name is Jackie Wins, and I'm always here with my buddy Jason Ray. How's it going today, Jason?
Doing great, Jackie. Thanks for having me.
Of course, of course. So today we're going to delve into a whole bunch of different topics. As everybody knows, we do start with about 4 or 5 different topics, and we go through each and every one of them. But before we start, this is recorded on Wednesday, and we did get a little bit of news earlier, so we do want to acknowledge it. That the Oklahoma State bus wasn't an accident. It sounds like everybody's okay, but we hope that everything continues to be okay and that nobody's too rattled and able to move forward onto the games this weekend. So we did want to acknowledge that and send, our thoughts and prayers out over there and hope everything's good to go, the Cowgirls. So on to the next. So our first segment, for those who are new here, it is called the State of the Diamond. Okay, this is where we talk about where we think softball currently is at, what's really happening around NCAA softball, and sort of delve in from there. So, Jason, we had a couple of darn good series this past weekend, and a lot of things have changed. What is your overall thoughts on just the overall state?
Yeah, so we talked about last week how close we are to getting the postseason, and so I know that a few of us, and one of the things, just kind of thinking through like this question where we wanted to kind of go with this, there's like 3 or 4 weeks before postseason starts on conference tournament, so there's a couple of teams that I think we had, or at least I had in my mind, is like kind of if not now, then when teams, and I think they're kind of coming to the forefront. So 2 teams that I'm really interested to see. Number one, how they finish off the regular season, and are they able to continue the success and kind of get to the Women's College World Series. So Arkansas and Nebraska are 2 of them that I mean, they're both right there in the top 5. They're probably going to, and I know we'll talk about this later, but they're probably going to be one of the top 8 teams, like if they continue going playing the way they are. So can they get to it? Can they get over the hump? Right. So Arkansas struggled. They've had the team, over the last few years, they've had teams that have been good enough to get there, but just for whatever reason, they've not been able to get over the hump and get to the World Series. And Nebraska was close last year, but they couldn't get there. And I think they've remedied one of the things that they struggled with last year. It was really just Jordy, right? I mean, she didn't have a ton of help from a depth perspective, but she's got a little bit more depth. She's got a little bit more help from a staff perspective, what that looks like. So yeah, I think those are 2 things that I'm looking at to see, can they continue the success? How do they finish off the regular season and that momentum into the conference tournament and the NCAA tournament as well.
Absolutely. It's been impressive to see how Nebraska has surrounded Jordy in her endeavors there. And overall, but not just like the program, right? But the fans too, So you do have, right, they have another ace in their pocket. It looks, they got Hannah Core over for defensively, and she's been lights out for them. So there's a lot of work there. I'm really excited to see where Nebraska goes. Arkansas as well. I think there was a lot of questions, where do they go after the Bri Ellis era, and how do they move forward? Lots of questions at the top of the season, but it looks like they finally hit their stride, which is pretty awesome for them, because I think, if they can make a good knock on the door to get to, regional, super regionals, and hey, make it to the Women's College World Series, they're a team that I think can upset a lot of people who they probably thought, what, they'll take a game. No, I think that they can probably knock 2, especially if they're burning from last year. So we'll see how that goes. For me, the State of the Diamond, when I'm looking at those top 5 teams, right, and I'm looking across X, and everyone's going wild about, where their team falls and so on, whether it be OU fans, Tech fans, Bama fans, Texas fans, everybody sort of in that mix over there. I think we get a lot of questions answered this weekend in terms of everyone's asking, like, where does OU fall amongst them, with Texas falling to Bama, and we'll talk about that a little bit more later, but it really mixed it up, especially because Bama was sort of a surprise this season. You thought they would be good, right? But I think they were picked 9th in the SEC in the preseason poll over there. And so no one thought they would be dominant. And they showed that capability. Of course, it's at Rhodes House, and God bless playing there. Oklahoma has fell to that trap before over there. So it's a hard place to play. But it's, it set the scene for this weekend, the scene setter, should we say. And and we will there. The big question in my mind, though, then goes, now where do we see Tech? And I think the biggest question is, and Tech fans are going to say, well, they've been the most dominant, things like that. And we sort of had a lot of these types of arguments when we were in the Big 12. Is the fact is the Tech schedule sucks, right? Like it is just the way it is. And to be fair, when they were going against some competition earlier in the season, before conference play, they faltered a little bit, and even a little bit into conference play. You questioned how they were going to react and found a few losses. So now that their schedule is weak, you're looking at all these decent series, and in the rankers want to reward those series. But then why are then a lot of people are getting like, well, then why is Tech all the way up there? And I understand it all, because if you look at the eye test, and I know we were talking about this before we aired, but we look at the eye test, I'm sure, like you look at Texas Tech and you're like, listen, they can also win it all. So like you don't want to discount them.
Yeah.
Just based on that. But it's hard because you just don't understand where they fall when everyone pretty much in the top 5 is playing each other. So it's a little bit tough in that way. And I can understand why, when we're looking at the state of the diamond, shall we say, and everybody across the NCAA wondering, who's really number one. At the end of the day, it really doesn't matter, because whatever the seeders are going to do when it comes to postseason is whatever they want to do. And whether they think the eye test and now all of a sudden they hold a ton of weight to the eye test, well, then yeah, Tech will be up there. And if they want to do head to head, then maybe, and RPI heavy, then Tech won't be up there, in terms of that spot. So I think that while people are very passionate, and I appreciate that personally, because it means people care, it doesn't really matter, right? Like it doesn't. So what are your thoughts?
Yeah, no. And so I think on your first point about Alabama, they were very impressive to me, very impressive this weekend. I think, the way they came out in game 1, Texas kind of dominated. Alabama didn't play very well until Texas got up to a big lead in game 2, I think a 4-0 lead early on in the game. And like, this kind of looked like a Texas sweep, right? Alabama's maybe not quite as good as we thought they might be coming in, but they rebounded well, and they really took it to Texas in game 2, and then won the game in game 3, won the series. And I think, I think one thing that's going to be interesting to see when Alabama plays, some of these teams on the neutral field, because Rhodes House is, if not the best, one of the best environments, one of the best home field environments in all of college softball, right? But still doing what they were able to do over the last couple of games. I think more impressively, how many runs they were able to put up on Texas was impressive for me. So yeah, and I think they're pretty much, I think, consensus, like right there, 1, 2, 3, in that neighborhood. But yeah, I mean, but going more further to your point about Texas Tech, it's one of the most, it'll probably be the most interesting team for the selection committee to identify where they need to be seated, right? Because to your point, if you're looking at if you don't look at any of the metrics and you just watch them play, right? You look at the scores and you watch them play, like they're one of the best 1, 2, 3 teams in the country without a doubt whatsoever. But I mean, you look at them, metrics wise and things that the committee typically looks at, to your point, what you'd mentioned, RPI, strength of schedule, things like that. They're not up in the top 5. Matter of fact, I don't know what it is today, but I think a couple of days ago they were around 10 or 11, and RPI, strength of schedule, is going to continue to go down. They do not have another top 25 team on their schedule for the remainder of the season. Now, they did pick up a couple of what I would call RPI boost games, midweek games throughout the rest of the year. They play Texas State once, and then they play I can't remember the other one, but it's a mid-level, kind of mid-major team that's not going to kill their SOS, right? But I mean, they don't play Oklahoma State, which is probably a bummer for them, right? Because that would be another top 25. Baylor is another one that they have, but they sort of falter. They haven't played very well. I think they're like 2-8 in their last 10 games. So, yeah, I mean, I think part of it's unfortunate. Just seeing all the comments on X about the rankings, and I think a couple of people just mentioned, so from a Texas Tech fan, so we're being punished because the Big 12 isn't as good. I mean, I think partly that's accurate. That's just kind of the way it goes when you look at strength of schedule, right? And it's I think it's to no fault of their own. I mean, I think we talked about this before. They're running into the Oklahoma treatment of the last few years. Teams just does that non-conference. They just don't really want to play them. So I get it. Like it's one of those things. So I think, it'll be interesting to see the way that looks. I think, just me personally, I think the eye test and I hate to say the name because they haven't been a traditional power, but the name and who they got on their roster will probably win over a little bit. And I would anticipate them getting seated probably above where they actually, I hate to say deserve, but where the metrics really say that they will. But that's going to be very, very interesting to watch because there's a lot of other teams. Like, I think Alabama is probably locked into the top 5. Like, it's going to be hard for them to get out of the top 5, specifically looking at their schedule down the stretch. They've got a lot of their series are winnable outside of, they do play Tennessee, which will be a tough one. But other than that, all of their series are very winnable. Right. So, Nebraska's another one. They don't play another. They played UCLA. Excuse me. I'm sorry. And then they don't have a lot of tough series down the stretch as well. I don't think they don't have another top 25. So you've got teams like Alabama and you've got teams like, Nebraska that are set in that top 5. So it'll be interesting to see if they get, if they're above that, because most areas have them probably anywhere from a 7 to a 10 right now, which is, kind of crazy based on, they've got the best record in softball. So best win-loss record. So yeah, that'll be interesting to see. But yeah, aside from Texas Tech, a lot of these things will work themselves out with some of these series that you got down the stretch. With Texas has a pretty tough schedule, and we talked a little bit last week, and I know we'll get into this, but Oklahoma has, their toughest stretch of the year is going to be these last 3-4 weeks of the season.
Absolutely. And we'll get into, for the viewers, we are going to do a little bit of an OU Texas breakdown, so feel free to stay for that later on in the show. Yes, both teams, OU and Texas, really, none of them then super easy. So it will be interesting to see how it falls. I also was just thinking, back in the day when we talked about the Oklahoma treatment, Oklahoma still had within conference some top players, right? Oklahoma State was pretty dominant, back in the day. And then, Texas was really good. You had Baylor a few years, they had a few aces up their sleeve that were highly competitive. So I just feel like it's a little bit down outside of your top heaviness of the Big 12 compared to what it was when OU and Texas was there. So continuing on though, so it talks about the state of the diamond. Now we're going to talk about who's on the bubble for hosting. So for those of you who are new to NCAA softball, so we'll say top 16 get seeded, right? Those are your regional hosts. Then of that top 16, the top 8 of it would then theoretically be your super regional hosts, so long as they win, or it'll go, whoever's the highest seed of them. Okay. But just to sort of keep you on pace, the layman's, as I like to say, and I was talking to Jason about this, the way of identifying who in the world is on the bubble is, well, then you just look at the top 16 teams of the ranking, and you go from about 15 to 17, 18, and that's who's on the bubble, good and bad. All right. Who's making it in and who's not. That being said, there are more, and, Jason's more of the metric guy and things like that, that can go into it and really look at who's more on the bubble based on a whole bunch of different things. But I'll talk about the layman's first. So technically, if we use Softball America's current ranking, all right, if we want to look at 15 is Duke, Mississippi State 16, Oregon 17, and LSU 18. So Duke, Mississippi State, Oregon, and LSU. Those are your bubble teams if you're just looking at the ranking and saying, okay, this is who wouldn't get seeded if this is how it went, right? Which is interesting to me because there's a lot of good in chaoticness. Like Mississippi State to me is highly competitive. I think they haven't won a lot of the series, but they're close in a lot and really giving teams some trouble. where, LSU, you could say in the latter half of their season, a little bit more like that. They're surprising in one aspect. You don't know what's happening the next. Duke, the same thing. So a lot of these teams have the story that's inconsistency, but moments of greatness. So to me, that's my theme. If I'm just looking at it going, that sort of makes sense, just by looking at the ranking. But what's your take, Jason?
Yeah, I kind of feel the same way when you look at some of these, for the top, probably the bottom two, 15 and 16 and even 14. I think there's probably like 6 or 7 teams really kind of jockeying for that position. You'd mentioned Duke, and Duke sort of kind of catapulted themselves up a little bit off of that bubble, and they're in a good spot right now. They've got a really, really good resume. So 6 teams that I'm kind of looking at: LSU, Virginia Tech, Arizona, Washington, Oregon, and Texas A&M. You'd mentioned a couple of these as well. Washington really, really had a very detrimental weekend. They lost twice to St. Mary's, which is going to really, really hurt them. They had, come into that series that tournament really with a big, a long winning streak, and so they're still leading the Big Ten. I mean, they're still undefeated in the Big Ten. They'll have some opportunities to redeem themselves. They have LSU, they have UCLA, they have Oregon late in the year, so they'll have some opportunities to redeem themselves. But they've sort of kind of taken themselves right on the bubble to a little bit further down. So I think right now for me, probably LSU, A&M, and Arizona are probably right there. Arizona's kind of like Washington, but not to the same level. Had a really, really tough loss against Iowa State on Monday, which really didn't hurt them as much as you would think, in terms of the metrics and things like that. We'll see how it shakes out this weekend and how they play. But they're another team that's just outscoring teams. But I think it'll be a big one. We talk about 2 of these teams, LSU and Arizona, do face off this weekend. So I think that will have a ton of postseason implications in terms of how that series goes, things like that. But Virginia Tech's another one that's interesting to me. They've had a really, really good season. The problem is their schedule is really, really rough. Their strength of schedule is in the 80s. So they've not. They're probably a little bit on the outside looking in, but they'll have some opportunities. So, yeah, those are some of the teams that I think. And Oregon's another one that you had mentioned, right? Like, it just haven't played as well as maybe we anticipated early on in the year, but they'll have some opportunities, but they just don't have a lot of quality wins. I think they've got either 2 or 3 top 25 wins on the season, and they've got some opportunities, like I said, coming down the stretch, but they're just going to have to take advantage of those.
Yeah, and where that sort of brings us into our next topic, which is thrivers versus non-thrivers, and to be fair, Oregon's one of those for me. In terms of they're not thriving overall, and the reason I say that is, yes, they have the opportunity to thrive, as you just mentioned, but it's still like every weekend I'm wanting more from them because they were so hyped, and maybe that's like a curse for them. I don't know, but for me, it's guys, I gotta win. You gotta win. You gotta start winning dominantly. You clearly have the talent, or the rankers, the preseason people would never put you up there to a top 5 team potentially. So you have the talent. You've got, Lombardi's got to put it together. And she knows that. It's just that it hasn't come together yet. But in the postseason, Oregon tends to light it up. So will it click then? But do they not even get a regional spot? I don't know. It's crazy to me to think that you're a top 5 preseason pick and you can't. You're on the bubble. So for me, that's a non-thriver in that aspect. The thriver for me, of course, is Alabama. In my mind, hey, you win the series at home. And in a top 5 series, incredible. But in terms of other series around, I actually think like the Florida Mississippi State series was huge for Florida to get out of that winning, because as I said before, Mississippi State is challenging and wants badly that really good series win. And man, Ricketts, you're this close, to getting that darn series win. And I do think that it would have raised more questions, just like now how everyone has questions about Texas, right? Well, oh, is the pitching good? Right. I think the same thing would have happened to Florida if they would have dropped that series. Like, oh, you had a couple good series wins, but now what? Now who are you? So I actually thought they were thriving to win that, and that they're on a decent trajectory to postseason. So those are my thoughts.
Yeah, those are good ones. Just I talked a little bit about these two teams, like Nebraska and Arkansas, continue to play well. Like Arkansas series sweep this weekend over Auburn, who is, my gosh, Auburn on the opposite side. They've sort of kind of fallen off the face of the earth, right? They got swept by kind of going over to the non-thriver. They got swept by Missouri, then they got swept here. They're in danger of maybe even missing the NCAA tournament if they don't get things together. Now they have to come back and they have to play Alabama this weekend at home. So I think those are two kind of a thriver, non-thriver for me. Just kind of looking at around the country, we talked a little bit about Duke. They continue to play really, really good softball, really good complementary softball. Swept Virginia this past weekend, who had only come into that series with 3 losses all year, and Duke handed them as many losses as they've received all year in just that one weekend. So they're right there behind Florida State. Florida State keeps rolling. Like, they're sort of one of those interesting teams. Like, they continue to win, but they don't really move. They haven't moved up much in kind of the rankings across the board. Now, they've got Stanford this weekend, which will be an interesting, a little bit, stepping up in competition a little bit. So will be interesting to see that, how that unfolds with them as well. So those are kind of some of the teams that, that I was thinking of. Kansas is another one that's a little bit below the radar. They were ranked in our Softball America poll for the first time. I don't know. I'd have to go back and look, because I don't ever, as long as I've been watching softball, don't ever remember Kansas being ranked in the top 25 in softball, but they're playing really, really well. One of the best freshmen in the country behind the plate as well. So yeah, it'll be interesting to see how they handle that success, right? Because they've kind of been the underdog. They've been the team that hasn't been not a horrible program by any means, but just kind of been under the radar. So they're positioned to make the NCAA tournament this year, and if they can continue to play well, I do believe they have Baylor this weekend in the series. So those are some of the teams that I'm thinking through.
Awesome. Yeah, no, I mean, it's sort of, when you look across, there's a lot of teams who need to do well. It feels like with the parity, you're like, no, you need this. But in reality, a lot of people are rowing in the same direction. You do have your outliers that are sinking, but in the end, you're sort of staying. Your top 25 team, your top 25 team. If you're on the bubble, you're on the bubble. But that's where you're sort of at. It's the race of who's number one. That's a interesting aspect always, but everyone's sort of panning out. So we're seeing quickly who's thriving, who's not. So teams that need to have a good weekend, they need it. I'm going to say OU. I'm going to say OU because for me, as an Oklahoma fan, we say this all the time, right? Oh, we need to win every weekend, of course. But first off, if the rotation stays, right, and we lose, XYZ opponents, we won't see Texas in regular season for at least 2 years, at least. So you had them at your house, then they won the Natty, okay? Now you're going, right? And historically, we've always dropped at least one at Texas. So there's going to be adversity. It's a good Texas team, and I think if you get destroyed, there's going to be a lot of questions. And you do have the ability to redeem yourself with some of your schedule. But at the same time, it's all about recency bias at this point. So if the pitching got better, blast Jen's back, and then all of a sudden the bats went cold for a little bit and everyone freaked out. This is a moment where it needs to come together. And I think they ironed it out. We were quite stubborn with our lineup and the leadoff position. We switched it up. We found some success. Now, can we make those adjustments on the fly? That historically has determined how far OU goes. And if we are unable to make adjustments on the fly, it's going to be a serious look in the face, because this is probably our biggest weekend if you really think about it. Yeah, we have big weekends coming up against good opponents, but in terms of what it means, right, at Oklahoma, this is it. Yeah, one game against Oklahoma State, that's bedlam, but whatever, right? But like, so you got to win. And whether it's 2 of 3 or 3 of 3, God bless, you got to win. So we'll see what happens.
Yeah, so I'll take two separate series, and I'll it's interesting that you talked about Oklahoma. So I think you can sort of make a case for Texas as well, right? Because losing 2 out of 3, Oklahoma really did what they needed to do in this first part of the season. They've only lost 1 game in conference, so they've done what they needed to do, right? They swept Kentucky. They looked very dominant last weekend, kind of in all facets, right? But I think with Oklahoma having a little bit of a leg up in terms of the standings of the SEC, I think this is really, really important for Texas, right? Coming off of a situation where they lost 2 or 3 to Alabama, and then coming home, you could certainly, I mean, you could make an argument either way, right? But I think you could make an argument that Texas has a lot of pressure on them, because if they're down 2, kind of in the loss column to Oklahoma, if they get swept or lose 2 out of 3, then they're continuing to chase. And for a team that has lofty expectations, and you've heard them, if you've watched any of those games this weekend, they mentioned it a couple of times that Mike White and the team really was focused on winning an SEC championship this year, right? They won the national championship. Obviously, their goal is to repeat and do all those things, but they wanted to win an SEC championship. So yeah, I mean, I think going in last year, I don't think anyone expected Oklahoma to sweep Texas, right? But they did. And so I think both teams are, obviously you want to win the series, but what you can't have for both sides, you can't allow the other team to sweep you, whatever happens, right? So I think that's one. And then the other one that I just want, Arizona and LSU, we talked a little bit about that, but I think that's equal. I mean, it's critical for both teams. I know I'm taking kind of both sides of it scenario with both of these series, but I think it's really important for both of them, right? I think Arizona needs to get some good quality wins, and coming off of the series where they did win 2 of 3 against Iowa State, but didn't play super well, and they are struggling immensely in the circle, like immensely. I mean, they gave up runs in bunches to Iowa State over the weekend, especially those last 2 games. And LSU on the other side playing really well. We talked about this last week on how good of a strategy, good of approach they had against Oklahoma. And then, they played really, really well in 2 games, and then they kind of had a little bit of a dud against Missouri in game 3, got shut out in that game. So what does that look like with them? So those are a couple ones that I'm thinking of. Auburn's another one. Like we talked a little bit about where they're at now from an SEC perspective. If they could get a series win, but even winning one right against Alabama would help in that way.
Absolutely, and it's going to be interesting to see this weekend, which sort of lends into our next topic, which is our OU Texas breakdown. For those who are wondering and are looking for the update for our bracketology report, that we'll do that either every other episode, things like so on as we get closer, just because it is going to change every weekend. And so if we can have a little bit of time, just to sort of see it mesh out, this way we're not sort of saying slightly the same things or one team off type of ordeal. So OU Texas, the Red River rivalry continues. Now we'll talk about this. These 2 programs hate each other. At least recent era. And when I spoke back to former OU players and things like that, and I once asked, is it rivalry? Like, from fans, we're always into it. Doesn't matter what sport. But in terms of, between the dying, right? Is it there too? And it was like, oh yeah. It is. And I thought that was incredible because you do, we've talked about this before. I mean, travel ball, a lot of these girls have either played with or against each other. So, how far did that extend? And there is no love between each side when they get together. It is not the greatest scene between the two. And there are visuals of that all over from recent years. But what it does provide is softball, one of the greatest series, in my opinion, every year. It's just electric. And I think both players this year come to the diamond with electric players, right? Whether you have Reese on one side, right? And then you have Wells and, so on from our side. You have your home run hitters. There's going to be home runs. I'm interested to see what their strategy is with Wells. I think we might start seeing potentially walks. The issue for me is if they decide to walk Wells, they got a lot of power behind. So they have to be very strategic if they feel like, let's say it's Kavan or whoever is in the circle, goes at her. Do they have a plan, right, for those next batters? Because she is situated around home run hitters. So biggest thing for me, if they can control Kai Minor, the most consistent player for OU, I think they limit runs. I don't think they stop runs. I think they limit them. That's the big key, in my opinion. We have home run hitters, but can you control some of these more consistent players that are generating momentum, that are generating people on base for some of those power hitters? Big question. No one's been able to do it super successfully. I mean, Kai's has a freshman is like 500 something at this point. Will be interesting to see if Kavan gets her, just because she hasn't, right? A lot of the other OU players have. So for me, it's about controlling those players for Texas, and for OU, it's about communication. When they pick Kavan, and historically they have, they take over Texas, because that's their ace, and everyone behind them is pretty good, but I wouldn't say your ace, right? And so, can we do that? Now, Kavan has, her pitches, in my opinion, have been quite crisp. When she's off, just like how Lowry is for us. But she's very good. So we'll see how OU goes at it. But that's, in my opinion, at least for Texas and OU, can you communicate? Can you adapt? And also for Texas, can you control and limit people on base and those consistent players?
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I think the key to the series, to each one of the games, is can the other staff get the other team out? Like, at the end of the day, can they do that? I would expect that we see from Oklahoma a lot of Audrey Lowry. I would expect from Texas you see a lot of Tegan Kavan. Like I would anticipate they probably start game 1 and game 3. And then you see what you got in game 2. Now, I mean, to your point about Kavan in Oklahoma, Oklahoma has hit her extremely hard in every game that they've faced except for one, right? Kavan really pitched well in the College World Series against them last year and really limited Oklahoma to a couple runs, right, in that game. But she was dominant in the World Series against everyone, right? She was the MVP for a reason. So, I think that. So I think does Oklahoma continue their dominance and how they've been able, to your point, were they able to pick her? Is she crisp in terms of hitting her locations, hitting her spots? What does that look like? I think for Oklahoma, keeping the ball in the ballpark is the biggest key. I mean, that's where they struggled in the circle, keeping the ball in the ballpark. Just kind of looking at that from a statistical perspective. Oklahoma's given up 39 home runs this year, 39. And they still have a pretty solid team ERA, right? Like across the board, Lowry's just above 2. Across the board, they still have a pretty solid ERA, 2.73. Texas is right there; they're like a 2.58, so pretty close in terms of that. Both teams have seemed to struggle, particularly Texas over the last couple of weeks. They have struggled with A&M, and they've struggled with Alabama outside of Kavan. Even Kavan had a couple of struggles for herself. So what does that depth look like, right? And I think the other one is, how does the how does the other team attack the other team's power hitters, right? How does Oklahoma, Lowry, Wachenio, Berzon, whoever gets in there, right? How do they attack Katie Stewart? How do they attack Reese Atwood? Their top 2 home run hitters. Like, are they able to keep them in check? Katie Stewart has 20. Let's see, Reese Atwood has 15. One of the best players in Texas history, right? So, how do they attack them? Are they able to limit the home runs? And I think the other thing for Oklahoma, if you can limit the walks, right? If you're giving up home runs, I think Patty has mentioned this a couple of times, like the way they pitch, they're going to give up some home runs, right? But if you can limit those to solo shots and you're not walking and giving up hits, and then you've got 2 and 3 run home runs, I think that's key. And to the other side of it, to your point, like how do they pitch Kendall Wells? Like you saw that, like they were starting to walk her. I think some intentional, unintentional walks, right? Like, and you saw it towards the tail end of that Kentucky series in the game 3 where they walked Kendall Wells, and then Gabby Garcia. I think it was Garcia that came up and hit a 3-run home run to end the game, right? So you've got to figure out, like, if that's your strategy, then you've got to make those good, solid pitches because she's got a lot of protection around her. I mean, you'd mentioned Kai Miner, who's done a really good job at kind of setting the table. And she's obviously, that's probably a spot that she's probably not going to relinquish in the next 3 years, right? I mean, now that she's sort of kind of separated herself in terms of what that looks like. But that middle of the lineup, you've got a lot of home run hitters there. Just from a lineup perspective, one thing that's going to be interesting for me is to look at just a couple of things on the pitching side and on the hitting side. Like, from a pitching perspective, do they go with Lowry in game 3? What they've done in the past is, they've really started throwing Berzon in game 3 the last couple of days, like, or couple of weeks. Do they continue to do that, or do they rely a little bit more on Lowry, or do they send Berzon out there and give her a little bit of a short lease? How does Alyssa Parker fit into this? She's come in kind of a relief duty, right?
Good point.
But she struggled a little bit against LSU. It was a tough environment, right, for the first time for a true freshman going into that, and this one's going to be even tougher, right? Do they? I think they do. Do they have confidence in what that looks like for that? And the other thing on the offensive side lineup, Sid has struggled at third. I mean, she's done really good from a defensive perspective. She's really good on the defensive side of it, but I think Patty's really kind of gone operated under this really kind of assumption that, hey, I've got enough bats in the lineup. I want to make sure I've got a good glove over there at third. I've got the defensive side, because obviously we know she's a very defensive-minded, pitching and defensive-minded coach, right? But if Oklahoma struggles a little bit in game 1, do they look at putting Parker over there, right? And so I think that'll be interesting, because unfortunately she just hasn't hit as well since she's sort of been inserted in that lineup after the injury to Nelly. And so I think those are some interesting questions. And I mean, it's going to be great. I mean, it's going to be a great series to watch. All the games are on the linear network, I believe. Friday, Saturday, and Sunday. I think they're all on ESPN. So will be exciting and fun atmosphere. And I think both teams will learn a lot about each other, right? I mean, I think this is one of the things that you love about playing these series. It's particularly pretty close to the end of the season. You get an opportunity to learn what your team is made of, and Oklahoma's really about to learn, right? And we've talked about this a little bit. They don't have a ton of quality wins. I mean, they have like 9 top 25 wins, right? But they don't have a ton of like great wins. Arizona's probably their best win, but now they've got Texas, they've got Georgia, they've got Arkansas, and they've got A&M. So probably 4 of their toughest series are all back to back to back to back. So Patty will learn a lot about her team for sure over these next few weeks. So it'll be exciting to watch.
Absolutely. And good point about Alyssa Parker. In my opinion, we sweep them last year and then they won the Natty, right? So like if you want to develop Parker, you put her in at some point. Like, right. And, whether that's if you see the games you're losing, whatever, she has to, that environment and that hatred, right, to OU and all of that is very World Series like, right? Of course, stadium wise, not the same. We get it. Okay. But in terms of like the heat on you and just the vitriol that comes with it, like you need her in there to sort of experience that. Because, they sort of felt that a little bit when they were at the Arizona State, Arizona World. But it's different. Like this is the heat, and so I think that, you find a way. But that also made me think one thing that I was very apparent this weekend and a little bit in LSU too, but I actually think more Kentucky because I think she settled in from coming back is that you really see there isn't a huge difference, but there is a great difference at the same time in the pitch calling. And you can just tell some general just signatures that happen and when they happen and that you didn't see, not Takini's fault. Don't take that, Oklahoma fans. I love the fact that she stepped in and she did a fabulous job. But there are patterns and then also just little sneaks that Jen does within her pitch calling that throws a batter off. And you don't really see it coming. And they communicate, and then boom, something different happens or a pitch was hidden. And I think that the fact that you can't chart it, she's only been here for 2 games, right? Or 2 series, helps OU. Because you just don't know, you understand what they throw well, you can identify certain pitches of theirs that they do throw, but the pitch calling is different. So any pattern that may have existed prior is different. And that is crazy, to think about midseason. So definitely, I think Jen plays a huge role in this. But it's also good, in my opinion, Reese always does a really nice job versus OU. She's just a baller, right? Straight up. But it's going to be her supporting cast. And I say that in both ways. Defensively for Texas and also offensively, like, Stewart, everybody, like not that these players do typically perform, but I'm saying like it has to. Like I felt like at times it wasn't clicking against Bama. Like they would gain that momentum and something would happen. And we sort of saw that, but a little bit larger of a scale before the World Series for Texas, and everyone went, oh no, what's happening right now? They're too talented to go back to that zone. So they have to be able to identify something. And honestly, it's about keeping the cool of the moment, right? The team that can stay steady, get angry, but not chaotic, right? That's who's going to take it. Because if you succumb yourself to the moment, you're frustrated, you're mad at umps, you're doing XYZ, like the other team's going to capitalize, and both have such power and athletic ability to change their game quickly that it'll be interesting. But I do anticipate it. While I thought Bama and Texas was a fabulous series, and Rhodes is an amazing place to play, I think both teams come to play for OU Texas. There is nobody who's like, like I'm going to be off a game. No. So excited to see how they go. I do think it comes down to a lot of coaching and a lot of game plan and a lot of preparation. And so we'll see.
No, I'm completely with you. And I think, there's just for these pitchers, I keep going back to the pitching, but I think there's an immense amount of pressure on both of these staffs, just almost trying to be perfect, right? Like, and so what does that look like in the delivery in terms of the execution, right? I mean, I think both staffs know, particularly around certain points of the lineup, like you've got to hit your spots, you've got to make sure your accuracy is pinpoint, and if you miss, then a lot of bad things can happen, right? And we saw that in Game 2 for Texas and Alabama. To your point about watching that series, I think Texas walked like 8 or 9 batters, had 3 or 4 wild pitches, like, and it's a different. Obviously, it's a different lineup that they're facing against Oklahoma than they were against Alabama. So, and on both sides, right? So that's why I think. I mean, I don't think you're going to see 15 to 14 type games, right? But you're going to see some runs scored, right? I mean, they're going to hit home runs. There's going to be a lot of runs scored. I think both sides, but yeah, it's going to be entertaining to watch for sure. Very entertaining.
Absolutely. And you don't know this, Jason, but before we go, there's some chitter chatter on X right now because there's some Texas Tech fan that decided to rile up the former OU players, calling it a weak dynasty and things like that, despite being in the Big 12 now. And sort of creating that for themselves. But so if you are interested, we will be uploading the podcast tonight on this Wednesday, April 12th. So feel free to chime in. But all you got to do is go to Kinsey Hansen, K9, and sort of see what that chatter looks like. But listen, our girls currently they're focused. But if you want to bring up those alumni, let me tell you, you'll see what a new rivalry looks like. Although they won't play us anyway. So we'll go from there. But first off, everybody, thanks for always tuning in. We greatly appreciate it. Of course, we're two friends chatting about softball. But it is at From the Stands SB on X and so on. Feel free to join the Patreon. We upload as we go, so please don't think of this as something like how Jason contributes to Softball America and things like that. That's a whole different world. That's a media site. This is just sort of a fandom. And so we contribute as we can, but it's not super consistent. It is a bridge site. That's what I call it in many aspects. So if you would want more and you want that consistency and we're not enough, that's your time to decide which media site you want to invest in and go from there. And there are a lot of people who do a great amount of work to keep that up, also former players. So it helps, especially with NIL and things like that. So please feel free to look at those sites if you're not getting enough from us and so on. But Jason, once again, always thank you so much. Everybody online, always thank you. Let's go for a good weekend of softball. And from my fandom, because of the weekend, Boomer Sooner, baby, let's go. Have a good one, everybody.